This season, Instacart has your back to school. As in, they've got your back to school lunch favorites, like snack packs and fresh fruit. And they've got your back to school supplies, like backpacks, binders, and pencils. And they've got your back when your kid casually tells you they have a huge school project due tomorrow. Let's face it, we were all that kid. So first call your parents to say I'm sorry, and then download the Instacart app to get delivery in as fast as 30 minutes all school year long. Get a $0 delivery fee for your first 3 orders while supplies last. Minimum $10 per order. Additional terms apply.
Achieving a gorgeous grin from home isn't a total mystery with Bite Clear aligners. Just don't be surprised if all of your sleuthing friends start asking, "What's your secret?" Begin by ordering your at-home impression kit today for only $14.95. Bite Clear aligners are doctor-directed and delivered to your door. Treatment costs thousands less than braces. Plus, they offer flexible financing, accept eligible insurance, and you can pay with your HSA FSA. Get 80% off your impression kit when you use code WONDERY at Byte.com. That's BYTE.com. Start your confidence journey today with Byte.
From Wish TV, this is All Indiana Politics Podcast with Phil Sanchez, Unfiltered.
And welcome to a special edition of the All Indiana Politics Podcast. Joining us today is Republican candidate for governor, Mike Braun. Thank you for coming in today.
Good to be on.
So our goal with these podcast interviews is to help our voters understand what shaped the candidates into who they are and what they stand for today. So you grew up in Jasper. Tell me what that was like. What are some things that really stuck with you from that time?
You know, I always describe it as Mayberry RFD. In a community like it then, it was 8,000 people. It's now 18,000. So I think the main drag is the only way you can get to and go through town. It's probably got 15 stoplights. Maybe had 3 when I grew up. It was a great public school system. It was a very Catholic community. It was just a wonderful place that you didn't appreciate probably back when you grew up, what a great place it was. But when I got out of high school, I went to Wabash College. My wife Maureen went to IU. We made it through there, got married the summer of 76, so that would be right after college, and then we went to Boston for a couple years. So where I'm from, faith, family, community, I mean, it would be the epitome of that. And you had parents that were right there with you, and that's a blessing. Not all families are like that, communities like it. Indiana, I've traveled to visit all 92 counties, and you know, we're a really neat state in that each county is kind of a version of it. We're a rural state outside of Indy Metro and maybe Lake County and Allen County, and a lot of landscape in between. So I've had the blessing of growing up in rural America, built a business over time that then became regional and a national company, and immensely blessed when any of your kids want anything to do with a business you've been involved in, and 3 of my 4 kids run it now. So I don't think any of that would have happened had we not chosen to come back to our hometown right after we spent 2 years in Boston, and I was literally headed to Wall Street, and something said, look the other way.
So you went to work for Meyer Body Company and eventually turned that into Meyer Distributing. What were some of the challenges you faced in growing that company?
Well, I was so anxious to have an opportunity, and I was working for a great company that a local entrepreneur had founded, making kitchen cabinets, and he wanted me to hang around and maybe, run the place someday. But I really wanted my own shot at something. So this little business sold almost all its products to farmers. Well, that was 6 months before the farm crisis. So it was wobbly when I got there. It was circling the drain, shortly afterwards. That's, for those that don't remember, the last time we had inflation like I think we've had now, created by the federal government currently, other forces then, but it was survival mode. It was a question of, were you going to, after you made a bunch of decisions that would have been probably easier financially, now the opportunity's in front of you, and it took 3 years to see if the business was even going to survive. So I started doing a milk run of truck accessories, selling mostly to dealerships. Had a fancy MBA and was a used truck and equipment dealer because that's all farmers were buying. So we started 2 new businesses to keep the original one afloat, and that worked out. And then it took 17 years before I felt I had a business that was scalable, completely different from the original, and that from 98 to 08 grew from just 20 employees to 300 in a regional company. And now it's got like 90 locations in 40 states, and a lot of that growth occurred after my 2 sons went to work there, 15, 20 years ago, one of my 2 daughters. So that was what I had always dreamed of. It just took a long time to get on its feet and then start to grow.
What were some of the biggest lessons you took from that period of your life?
Well, I learned low overhead. My office was in a used mobile home for 17 years because it didn't have an office traditionally. It had a mobile home next to the building. That wasn't my idea of probably a great startup opportunity, but it is what it is. And so I took that hard scrabble start, knew how to manage costs. Otherwise, you weren't going to have a chance to build new revenues. Once I got it back on its feet, and then it's a question of how do you grow your business revenue-wise. And, did it where very little of my MBA came into play. It was more the school of hard knocks that was teaching me what to do. And so I think that then has been handy, not only in growing the business, but even when I got into the political realm. Very few senators have signed the front side of a paycheck. Almost none of them have. Hardly any of the governors do. And I'll cite that as my biggest advantage in running against my 2 opponents here in this gubernatorial race. Our state government's one of the biggest businesses in our state. 30 agencies, 30,000 employees. I did something similar to that as a career. And when I've been in D.C., the fact that I was involved in agriculture, running a small business, knowing what economic growth is about, I didn't have to be schooled on the issues by 20 to 30-year-old staffers. So that's why we've gotten a lot done there in 5.5 years. So all of that comes into play, I think, to bring me to this point in time.
What led you to get into politics?
Well, back at Wabash College, I was in the Youth for Lugar campaign. And a guy named Mark Miles, who runs the Speedway, he was part of that group. Our leader was a guy named Mitch Daniels. I think that was between my sophomore and junior year there. I've got a box of bumper stickers and some other things associated with it. So I had an interest then, and that was when Dick Lugar ran against Birch Bayh and got beat, and then beat the other senator from southern Indiana, Vance Harkey, the mayor of Evansville, 2 years later. So then you go to business school, you live away, life interrupts, and I didn't really think about public service until 2004 much, and that call came from my wife to be on our local school board. We live in a rural district, so they had to recruit somebody to be on the board, and she politely, after 10 minutes, said she didn't have time to do it, but said maybe my husband would be interested. So literally, that's how I got into the public arena. Did that for 10 years, and then Mark Messmer, who's now the congressional candidate in the 8th District, called me when he wanted to run for state senate. That is when I ran for state rep, served 15, 16, and 17. That brings you up to date. I took off 2018 to run for U.S. Senate.
So when you made that decision, you had a contested primary and you were up against an incumbent in the general election, Democrat Joe Donnelly. What was that like, going from campaigning for a state rep seat to campaigning statewide?
It was like this. Everybody would, without saying it, say that's a fool's errand. They knew you had a good track record. You had a great record on building a business from scratch to something significant, but that doesn't necessarily parlay into how politics works. I think there are a lot of similarities. I had to make sure I did it on a solid foundation. I interpreted what I think Trump represented. Half the country teed off with business as usual in D.C. He had won Indiana by 19 points in 16. He won it by 16 points again in 20. But I had to figure, was there a market for a U.S. senator that wasn't going to be from the farm system of politics? And that was a good idea. But then, no political legacy. You start with 1% in the first public opinion poll. That's hard to attract any donors. I didn't have any liquidity. So you had to be resourceful to get the first base, round second, and then end up beating two sitting congressmen. And then you're euphoric. You do that. You're up 1 point on Joe Donnelly as a sitting senator. And then you deal with nearly 5 months of Chuck Schumer and George Soros spending $30 million to ruin your reputation based on nothing other than you're a business owner, therefore you're heartless, you're a liar and a hypocrite. That's the brutality of politics at the national level. So if you didn't have thick skin, it needed to thicken up. And I knew a lot of that. And I just had to deal with it because it's a tricky navigation to make when you're trying to buck the trend of how it normally works.
What are some things that you wish people understood about the way things work in Congress and, for that matter, in the Indiana General Assembly that don't necessarily get a lot of attention?
So the biggest thing is in D.C., we're so evenly divided, and there's a thing called the filibuster. So that means you need 60 senators to agree on anything that's going to pass. And we found a way to get more stuff passed than any other Republican senator as a freshman office because I could see how the system worked. I don't get much cred for that, but that's a proud feature of the last Congress, and I think we'll do that again in this current Congress. It ends here. Officially we're lame ducks after the November election. Solving those big issues, I don't think are going to occur at D.C. because it's going to be hard to get 60 senators to agree. One side wants more government and will borrow and spend from our kids and grandkids to do it. The Democrats, Republicans generally want to play defense, aren't interested in health care. Some of the things are making our military work more efficiently, addressing entitlements to make sure they'll be there for future generations. We generally just don't weigh in. We're flat-footed politically. To me, it made more sense because I think the federal government's got so oversized and it's so contentious. I think a lot of the real issues get fixed at the state level. And when you run for governor, you can set the agenda. We got a supermajority here. It seems like we could get some stuff done that would benefit all Hoosiers if you have the right leadership in the governor's office and you know how the mechanics work with a proven record. That's why I decided to come back and run for governor.
Were you surprised at the number of candidates who jumped into the Republican primary, even though you got in right away?
Well, I came in, ironically, the same day the lieutenant governor did, and another candidate, Eric Doden, had been in already a year, and then 3 others jumped in afterwards. That's what you call a feisty primary. It ended up being the most expensive primary, gubernatorial or senatorial, in the history of our state. I mean, I always embrace competition. That was a lot. And it's been a miracle that we've been able to put all parties together backing my effort into the general election, which normally occurs. Bruising, feisty primaries make it a little more difficult. That's part of what you need to learn to do, too, if you're going to get into the political realm. It would have been nicer had it been like most, to where you go in with very little competition in the primary. That wasn't the case. So then you got to adjust to it, and we won it with authority in terms of the other 5 candidates, but it still was contentious because you had so many people vying for it.
You wanted Julie McGuire to be your lieutenant governor candidate. The delegates at the Republican convention instead chose Micah Beckwith.
Yes.
How would you describe your relationship with Beckwith since then?
Very good. And I knew Micah actually before he'd bring a leadership group out to D.C. and I would speak to them. So we had a relationship. He actually got with me before he decided to run. And I wished him well because I'm not a hypocrite. I believe in anyone being able to exercise their right to run. I embrace competition, and it worked out to where he's been a great partner. He represents the grassroots of our party that feels like it's neglected often. I'd agree with that. He was out on the property tax issue way before most others. I'd been hearing that for a year about being the biggest issue. Was the first gubernatorial candidate to put something out there that had some practicality to it. Jennifer McCormick followed shortly afterwards because she had to. But Julie McGuire would have been wonderful because she's got legislative experience. She's still going to be there in the legislature to work with me and Micah. And we had to play with the structure of what could happen, and it's worked out well.
Now, Beckwith does have a history of making some fairly inflammatory remarks. Notably, after the January 6th attack on the Capitol, he recorded a video in which he said that God told him that he sent the people who attacked the Capitol. What do you say to people who might be concerned about having someone like that a heartbeat away from the governor's chair?
Well, first of all, a lot of what you say in the past in the business of politics, you can frame that into a commercial or something. So he's been very good about sticking on the agenda of what I've talked about. When you're talking about grassroots issues, you're going to find a lot of that from either side of the aisle. If you weren't necessarily staging to get into politics someday, that becomes an issue. All I can tell you, that's not been part of anything that's been out there since the primary, and we're focusing on the kitchen table issues of workforce, education, reforming health care. No gubernatorial candidate would ever touch that. Arguably, it's the biggest thing that draws resources out of our economy. We got some of the most expensive health care with some of the poorest outcomes. Rural broadband, we touched on that earlier. Affordable housing, child care, cost of electricity, and even is it going to be available for a lot of the new businesses that want to come here. Water is now an issue. Those are the things I hear most Hoosiers talking about. They're worried about the border. They don't like the sugar high economy that was caused by the Biden administration. And Trump needs to stay focused on what was working pre-COVID. And if he does that, he's going to do well at the national level. And state races are tied to the national issues as well. So there are a lot of swirling components to running a successful campaign. And I've been through 3 tough ones prior to it, and this is no different.
Your opponent, Democrat Jennifer McCormick, has released a number of very, very highly detailed plans on education, taxes, that sort of thing. Can we expect a similar level of detail from your campaign between now and election?
Yeah, she's doing that and probably not doing them in a way that has a chance to pass through a supermajority Republican legislature. So if you're out there espousing stuff that is going to be endorsed by the party at the federal level, that's not going to go anywhere. That doesn't mean the issues aren't important. But if you're going to get it through a supermajority Republican legislature, it's going to take an entrepreneurial Republican governor to do that. And fleshing stuff out in detail when it has no chance of going anywhere is disingenuous, because a lot of what she's talking about, if it's got any part of what she embraces in terms of the national party, that's not going to fly in Indiana. I was able to go to D.C. in even a more contentious environment and get stuff done. And I want to make sure the public understands it. I've signed the front side of a paycheck. If you want to be a governor of our state, you'd at least think that was important if you want to run one of the biggest businesses in our state. So all of that, we'll have a couple times to debate it, and I feel real good about that. I love the debate. I love to have the back and forth of making the case. If you're not interested in doing that, you should never consider running for senator or governor.
Mike Braun is the Republican candidate for governor in the 2024 election. Thank you for coming in today.
My pleasure.
From Wish TV, this is All Indiana Politics Podcast with Phil Sanchez. Unfiltered, in-depth, nonpartisan coverage, exclusive interviews with Indiana's political leaders. Subscribe to this podcast and listen weekly here on the All Indiana Podcast Network. And be sure to discover even more great podcasts at allindianapodcastnetwork.com.